hammering on the door came before dawn, hard enough to shake the thin wooden frame of the house. Elara Voss sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and reached for the shawl at the foot of the mattress. Outside, dogs were barking across the village, and she could hear boots on the frozen ground, many of them, moving with purpose. She crossed the small room and found her father already awake, sitting in his chair by the cold hearth, his face pale in the gray light. Edwin Voss had not slept in days. The debt collectors from the Ashgrove pack had given him one more week, and that week had ended the night before. "Stay behind me," he said, though his voice shook and his legs could barely hold his weight. Elara did not stay behind him. She opened the door herself, because she knew that hiding would only make things worse, and she had learned long ago that fear given a face was easier to face than fear left in the dark. 6 men stood outside, wrapped in fur cloaks marked with the gray wolf sigil of the Ashgrove pack. Their leader, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward and held up a rolled parchment. "Edwin Voss," he said, "your debt to Alpha Renfield stands at 40 gold pieces, plus the interest owed for the delay. You have nothing to pay it with, so we take the house, and we take what is inside it." "Please," Edwin said, pushing past his daughter despite his weakness. "Give me until spring. My crops will." "You said that last spring." The scarred man's eyes moved past Edwin and settled on Elara, and something in his expression made her skin go cold. "Perhaps there is another way to settle this. The girl is young, healthy. Alpha Renfield's son has taken notice of her before." Elara felt her stomach twist into a knot. She had seen the way Renfield's son looked at girls in the market, the way he treated them like objects to be collected rather than people to be respected. She would rather lose everything she owned than become part of that man's household. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," the scarred man said, already turning to his men, already giving the order to begin loading the cart with whatever furniture and tools they could find. It was in that moment, as her father sank back into his chair with his head in his hands, that a rider appeared at the end of the village road. He wore no fur cloak and no pack colors that Elara recognized. His horse was black and moved with the calm confidence of an animal used to long journeys, and the man on its back sat straight, watching the scene unfold with sharp, assessing eyes. "That's enough," the rider said, and though he did not raise his voice, every man in the yard stopped what he was doing. The scarred man turned, annoyed at first, then suddenly uncertain. "This is Ashgrove business. You have no place here." "I have every place here," the rider said, swinging down from his horse. "I am here on behalf of the crown, collecting information on debts owed across the border villages, before the spring tax review. If Alpha Renfield wishes to seize property before that review is complete, he will need to explain himself to the king directly." The mention of the king changed everything. The scarred man's men lowered the furniture they had been carrying. The scarred man himself straightened his shoulders, though his jaw was tight with anger. "We will report this delay to Alpha Renfield," he said. "Do that," the rider answered, and there was something final in his tone that ended the conversation before it could continue. The men from Ashgrove mounted their horses and rode away, leaving the yard in an uneasy silence. Elara stood frozen for a long moment, watching them disappear down the road, before she turned to look at the stranger who had stopped them. He was younger than she had expected, though there was nothing young about the way he carried himself. His dark hair was cut short and practical, his clothes plain but well made, without any crest or symbol to mark his rank, and yet everyone in the yard, herself included, had obeyed him instantly. "Thank you," her father said, struggling to his feet. "Whoever you are, you have saved my daughter and my home. I do not know how to repay such a kindness." The stranger studied Edwin for a moment, and then turned his attention to Elara, his gaze steady and searching, in a way that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. "There is a way to repay it," he said finally, "but it is not a simple one, and I would rather explain it somewhere more private." He did not give his name in the yard. He did not need to. Word had already begun to spread through the village that a man matching his description had been seen near the capital only days before, and by the time Elara sat across from him at the small table inside her father's house, she understood, with a mixture of disbelief and dread, exactly who she was speaking with. Cale Thornwood, the Alpha King of Thornwood Kingdom, ruler of the largest and most powerful pack territory in the region, a man whose name was spoken with equal parts respect and fear. "You are the king," she said, because someone had to say it aloud. "I am," he answered, without any pride in the admission, "and I need something from you that I cannot ask of anyone in my own court." He explained the situation plainly, the way a man explains a problem he has turned over in his mind many times before finding a solution he can live with. Duke Ransom Blackwood, ruler of a neighboring territory and second in line to challenge the throne under old pack law, had been pushing for months for Chaol to take a mate. It was tradition, Blackwood argued, for an alpha king to have a queen at his side, and without one, Chaol's claim to the throne could be challenged in the Spring Council, when the ruling packs gathered to review the succession laws. "Blackwood does not care about tradition," Chaol said. "He cares about power. If I have no mate, he will use the council to force a vote, and he has spent years buying the loyalty of enough lesser packs to win that vote. If I marry, even for show, his challenge falls apart before it begins." "And you want me to marry you," Elara said slowly, trying to make sense of the words even as she spoke them. "I want you to pretend to marry me," Chaol corrected, "for 1 year, until the council session ends, and Blackwood's challenge is no longer possible under the law. After that, the arrangement ends, quietly, and you return to whatever life you choose, with resources enough to build it properly. Your father's debt to Ashgrove will be paid in full tonight. You will never need to worry about men like the ones in your yard again." Elara looked at her father, who was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a mixture of hope and guilt, as though he understood exactly what he was asking of her simply by staying silent and letting her consider it. "Why me?" she asked. "You do not know me. There must be 100 women in your own court who would agree to this without hesitation." "That is exactly the problem," Chaol said. "Anyone in my court would agree, because they want to be queen in truth, not in name only. They would use the year to secure a real claim, to bind themselves to me through pack law in ways that would be difficult to undo. I need someone with no interest in the crown, someone who wants nothing from me beyond what we agree to tonight, and who will walk away when the year ends without a fight." It was, Elara realized, both an insult and a strange kind of compliment. He was choosing her because he believed she wanted nothing from him. He was right, though not entirely for the reasons he assumed. "And if I refuse?" "Then I ride back to the capital tonight and find another solution," Chaol said. "Your father's debt will still be paid. I do not make kindness conditional on agreement, but I would be lying if I said I did not hope you would say yes." Elara sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. A year of pretending, of living inside a lie built to protect a throne she had no interest in, surrounded by a court that would surely resent an outsider stepping into a role meant for one of their own. Against that, her father's safety, and her own freedom from men who saw her as property to be traded for unpaid debts. 1 year, she said finally, and when it ends, I leave with no strings attached, no pack claim, no expectations. Agreed, Chaol said, and something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been holding his breath since he arrived in the village and had only now allowed himself to release it. They left before sunrise, her father's tears mixing with relief as he embraced her at the door, promising to write, promising to wait for her safely, promising that this would be the last hardship their family faced. Elara carried only a single bag of belongings as she followed Chaol Thornwood down the village road, away from everything familiar, toward a castle and a crown, and a role she had never imagined for herself. She did not look back. She had learned that looking back only made leaving harder, and she suspected that in the year ahead, she would need every bit of strength she had simply to keep moving forward. The road to the capital stretched long and gray before them, and somewhere at its end waited a throne room full of strangers who would soon call her their queen, though none of them, not even the king riding silently beside her, yet understood how much that pretense was about to cost them both. They traveled for 3 days before reaching the capital, and Elara found the journey itself a slow, careful unraveling of everything she thought she understood about the man beside her. Chaol rode with the discipline of someone accustomed to long marches, choosing their path with quiet efficiency, avoiding the main roads where merchant caravans and curious travelers might recognize him, and spread word of his unusual companion, before he was ready for that news to reach the wrong ears. On the first night, They made camp beside a shallow stream, and Alara watched him build a fire with practiced hands, the same hands that had signed contracts and issued commands to armed men without hesitation only hours earlier. He offered her the better half of the bedroll without being asked, and took the harder ground near the fire for himself, a small kindness that surprised her more than she expected it to. "You do not need to treat me as fragile," she said, settling near the flames. "I have slept on worse ground than this before." "I do not think you fragile," Kale answered, feeding another branch into the fire. "I simply believe that if I am asking you to give up a year of your life for my sake, the least I can offer in return is a comfortable place to sleep." She studied him across the firelight, trying to reconcile the careful courtesy he showed her now with the cold authority he had wielded so easily in her village. "You surprise me," she admitted. "I expected a king to be more distant, more certain of his own importance." "I have learned that certainty is often mistaken for wisdom," Kale said, "when in truth, it is usually closer to fear, dressed in confident clothing. I make decisions because someone must, not because I am always certain they are correct ones." They spoke little after that, though the silence between them felt easier than Alara had anticipated, filled with the quiet sounds of the stream and the settling fire rather than any awkwardness. She found herself watching the way exhaustion softened his features once he believed she had fallen asleep, the brief moments where the weight he carried seemed to slip from his shoulders before he caught himself and straightened again, as though even alone in the dark he could not fully allow himself to rest. On the second day, they crossed paths with a group of travelers whose wagon had lost a wheel on the rough forest track, and Kale, without hesitation, dismounted to help the struggling family lift the axle, while Alara held the frightened horses steady. It was such a small thing, a king kneeling in the mud beside strangers who had no idea who he truly was, but it told her something about him that no formal introduction ever could have. "Why help them?" she asked, once they were riding again, the family's grateful calls fading behind them. "You could have simply ridden past, no one would have known." "I would have known," Kale said simply, and did not elaborate further, though Alara found herself thinking about that answer for the rest of the journey, turning it over like a small stone smoothed by a river, trying to understand the shape of a man who ruled a kingdom, but still stopped to lift a stranger's wagon wheel from the mud. By the third evening, as the towers of the capital finally came into view against the darkening sky, Alara felt the weight of what she had agreed to settle fully over her for the first time. She had spent the journey distracted by the immediate practicalities of travel, by small moments of unexpected kindness, by the strange comfort of Kale's quiet company. Now, staring at the distant silhouette of the castle that would become her home for the next year, the reality of the arrangement pressed down on her with sudden, undeniable weight. "Are you frightened?" Kale asked, noticing the shift in her posture. "Yes," she admitted, seeing no reason to pretend otherwise. "I have never been anywhere like this. I do not know how to be a queen, even a pretend one. Neither did I know how to be a king when the crown first fell to me," Kale said. "I learned by watching, by making mistakes, by allowing people I trusted to correct me when I strayed too far from what the kingdom needed. You will learn the same way, and you will not be entirely alone in it." It was not a grand reassurance, not the kind of speech that might have appeared in the old stories her mother once told her as a child, of kings and queens and fated love found across great distances. But it was honest and steady, and Alara found herself holding on to those words as the castle gates finally came into full view, its gray walls rising higher with every step their horses carried them closer, marking the beginning of a year she could not yet imagine the true shape of. The gates of Thornwood Castle rose out of the mist like something carved from the mountain itself, gray stone walls stretching higher than any building Alara had ever seen, banners bearing the Black Wolf crest snapping in the wind above the towers. She had imagined the castle many times during the long ride from her village, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it, the sheer weight of history and power pressing down on her as the gates opened and guards on either side bowed their heads to their king. She felt every eye on her the moment she dismounted in the courtyard. Servants paused in their work. Guards exchanged glances. A pair of nobles crossing toward the main hall stopped mid-conversation to stare openly, whispering behind gloved hands. "Ignore them," Kale said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "They will grow tired of staring eventually." "Will they?" Alara asked, though she doubted it. A woman approached from the main entrance before Kale could answer. moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who ran the castle's daily affairs, whether anyone gave her the title for it or not. She was perhaps a few years older than Alara, sharp-featured, dressed in the deep green of the royal advisors, her eyes narrowing with open suspicion as she took in the sight of the king returning, with an unfamiliar woman at his side. "My king," she said, offering a shallow bow that carried more formality than respect. "I was not informed you were bringing a guest." "Lyra, this is Alara Voss," Cale said. "She will be staying with us. I will explain everything in the council chamber within the hour. Please have a room prepared near the royal wing, and send for the seamstresses. She will need appropriate clothing before tonight." Lyra's gaze moved over Alara slowly, taking in her simple travel dress, her plain boots, the single worn bag slung over her shoulder, and Alara felt herself being measured and found wanting in an instant. Whatever conclusions Lyra drew, she kept them behind a carefully neutral expression, though the tightness at the corner of her mouth suggested she had already formed several. "Of course, my king," Lyra said, and turned on her heel to give the necessary orders, leaving Alara standing in the courtyard feeling smaller than she had felt since childhood. The council chamber, when they reached it an hour later, held 6 people whose names and titles washed over Alara faster than she could remember them all. Advisors, generals, and one elderly woman, introduced only as Petra, the royal healer, who studied Alara with far kinder eyes than anyone else in the room. Cale stood at the head of the long table and explained the arrangement in the same plain terms he had used in her father's house, though here the reactions were far less understanding. "A stranger from the border villages," one of the advisors said, an older man with silver hair and a permanent frown. "My king, this is reckless. We know nothing of her family, her loyalties, whether she might be working for Blackwood himself." "She is not working for anyone," Cale said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced the men in Alara's village. "I chose her precisely because she has no connection to court politics. That is the point." "And if the council discovers the marriage is false?" Lyra asked, arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on Alara, as though she might find the answer written somewhere on her face. "Blackwood is not a fool. He will look for cracks in this story, and if he finds them, the consequences will be far worse than if you had simply remained unmarried." "Then we make certain there are no cracks to find," Cale said. "Alara will need to learn the customs of court quickly. Lyra, I want you to oversee that instruction personally. You understand the political landscape better than anyone else here." Lyra's expression flickered with something close to reluctance, but she nodded, because refusing a direct order from her king was not something she was willing to do in front of the full council. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing timing, the announcement of the engagement, the ceremony that would need to take place before the spring council session, and the careful management of information to keep the arrangement believable to outsiders. Alara said little, feeling increasingly like a piece being moved across a board by players far more experienced than herself, but she listened carefully, memorizing names and alliances, trying to build a map of the dangers she would need to navigate in the months ahead. That evening, after the seamstresses had fitted her for new dresses, and a servant had shown her to a room far grander than anything she had slept in before, Lyra arrived at her door without warning, carrying a stack of books and a look of grim determination. "If you are going to convince anyone that you belong here, you need to understand how this world works," Lyra said, setting the books down on the small writing desk. "Pack hierarchy, court etiquette, the history between our kingdom and Blackwood's territory. You have perhaps 2 months before the engagement becomes public knowledge, and I intend to make sure you do not embarrass the crown, or yourself, when that happens." "Why do you care so much?" Alara asked, genuinely curious, rather than defensive. "You clearly do not trust this arrangement. You could simply let me fail, and prove your point to the council." Lyra's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alara thought she might refuse to answer. Then something in her posture softened, just slightly. "Because I have served King Cale since we were both children," she said. "I watched what happened to him after his brother died. I watched the guilt nearly break him, watched him rebuild himself into someone who could hold this kingdom together, through sheer will alone. Whatever this arrangement is, whatever it means to you, it matters to him more than he will admit. I do not trust you yet, but I trust him, and he chose this path, so I will make sure you do not become the reason it fails." It was the most honest thing anyone in the castle had said to her since her arrival, and Alara found herself grateful for it, even wrapped in suspicion as it was. She spent the following weeks buried in Lyra's lessons, learning the intricate rules of who could be addressed by name, and who required a formal title, which pack symbols represented alliance, and which represented old rivalries, the long and bloody history between Thornwood and Blackwood that stretched back 3 generations. She learned too about the brother Chaol had lost, though only in fragments, pieced together from careful conversations with Petra during evening visits to the healer's quarters. His name had been Ronan, and he had died 5 years earlier during a border skirmish that Chaol had been meant to lead himself before a fever kept him confined to bed. Ronan had taken his place and had never returned. He carries that loss like a stone in his chest, Petra told her one evening, mixing herbs at her work table with steady, practiced hands. He does not speak of it, but it shapes everything he does, every decision he makes. He became king a year sooner than anyone expected, and he has spent every day since trying to prove he deserved to survive when his brother did not. Elara thought of those words often in the weeks that followed, watching Chaol move through the castle with the same distant formality he had shown since their first meeting, rarely speaking to her beyond what was necessary for the arrangement to hold together. He was polite, he was fair, but he kept a careful distance, as though allowing himself to know her too well might complicate something he had worked hard to keep simple. She told herself that distance suited her fine. She had not come to Thornwood Castle to build a friendship with a king who saw her as a solution to a political problem. She had come to save her father, and in a year, she would leave with her debt paid and her freedom intact, and none of this would matter anymore. But even as she told herself that, she found herself watching him across the dining hall in the evenings, noting the way his shoulders carried tension even in moments of quiet, the way his eyes would sometimes drift toward the window, as though searching for something in the distance that no one else could see. She did not know yet what that searching meant. She only knew that despite every reason she had to keep her heart guarded, something about the weight he carried alone had already begun, quietly and without her permission, to catch her attention. The engagement announcement was set for the end of the month, at a ceremony that would introduce her to the full court and to the watching eyes of Blackwood's spies, who Lyra assured her would already be gathering information from the moment the news became public. Elara spent her final days of relative anonymity practicing the careful walk, the measured speech, and the composed expression that Lyra insisted would be necessary to survive what was coming. In the weeks between her arrival and the announcement, Elara also began to understand the quiet rhythms of the castle itself, the small routines that governed daily life behind the grand formality of court occasions. She learned which servants moved through the halls before dawn to light the fires, which kitchen staff would sneak her warm bread if she visited early enough, which guards nodded to her with genuine friendliness rather than the wary politeness most of the court still offered. One such guard, a young man named Dalen who had grown up in a village not unlike her own before joining the Royal Guard, became an unexpected source of comfort during those uncertain early weeks. He found her one morning sitting alone in the eastern courtyard, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and rather than treating her with the careful distance most of the castle staff maintained, he simply sat down nearby and struck up a conversation about nothing in particular: the weather, the coming harvest season, small talk that felt like a lifeline to the ordinary world she had left behind. "You do not need to worry about impressing everyone at once," Dalen told her, after she admitted her fear about the upcoming announcement ceremony. "Most of them are only nervous themselves, unsure what to make of change. Give it time. People soften once they understand you are not a threat to anything they value." His kindness meant more to her than he likely realized, and she found herself grateful for these small pockets of normalcy scattered through the otherwise overwhelming grandeur of castle life. Lyra noticed the friendship developing, and, rather than discouraging it, as Elara half expected, seemed quietly pleased that she was finding footing among the castle's staff, even if the nobility remained more difficult to win over. The lessons with Lyra grew more intense as the announcement date approached, moving beyond simple etiquette into the delicate art of political conversation, how to answer questions without truly answering them, how to read the subtle signals of alliance and rivalry that governed every interaction among the gathered nobility. Elara absorbed it all with a determination that surprised even herself, driven by the knowledge that any mistake could unravel not only her own position, but the fragile political balance Chaol had built the entire arrangement to protect. She also spent increasing time with Petra, whose quiet wisdom offered a different kind of education entirely, lessons not in politics but in the deeper history of the kingdom, the old traditions surrounding pack bonds and mate recognition that most nobles treated as ceremonial formality, but that Petra clearly regarded as something far more significant and real. "Do you believe in true bonds?" Elara asked her one evening, curious despite herself, as Petra measured dried lavender into small jars. "I have seen enough of them in my years as healer to know they are not merely old superstition," Petra said. "Though I have also seen many marriages built on far less, marriages of convenience and calculation that nonetheless grew into genuine partnership over time. Love does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it grows quietly, in the spaces between duty and habit, until one day you look up and realize it has become the truest thing in your life." Elara turned the words over in her mind long after the conversation ended, though she told herself firmly that such musings had no place in an arrangement built entirely on pretense, meant to end cleanly within a single year, regardless of whatever small kindnesses or unexpected understandings might grow between herself and the king in the meantime. She did not know, as she stood before the mirror on the night before the announcement, staring at a reflection dressed in silk and jewels she barely recognized as her own, that the ceremony ahead would test her in ways no amount of preparation could fully account for, or that the danger circling Thornwood Castle was far closer and far more immediate than anyone in the council chamber had yet realized. The great hall of Thornwood Castle had never held so many people at once, or so Lyra claimed as she adjusted the final pin in Elara's hair with hands that trembled slightly, despite her calm expression. Every noble family from the kingdom's territories had traveled for the announcement, along with representatives from allied packs, and, though no one said it aloud, at least 2 guests everyone suspected were reporting directly back to Duke Blackwood. "Remember what we practiced," Lyra said, stepping back to study her work. "Chin level, shoulders back. Let the king lead the conversation whenever possible, and if anyone asks a question you are unsure how to answer, smile, and say you would rather not discuss politics on such a joyful occasion. No one will push further than that." "And if someone does push further?" Elara asked. "Then find me," Lyra said simply, and for the first time since their meeting, there was something almost warm in her voice. The hall itself had been transformed for the occasion. Banners of black and silver hanging from the high rafters, long tables laden with food that Elara suspected had cost more than her family had earned in a decade. She stood at the entrance beside Cale, who wore formal robes trimmed in silver that made him look every inch the king his people expected, and felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the herald announced their arrival to the waiting crowd. The applause that followed was polite but restrained, and Elara understood immediately that most of the room was watching her the way one watches an unfamiliar animal, waiting to see whether it would behave as expected or reveal something dangerous beneath its calm exterior. They moved through the crowd together, Cale's hand resting lightly at the small of her back, guiding her from conversation to conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life performing for an audience. Elara found the rhythm of it easier than she had expected, smiling when appropriate, deflecting questions about her family's history with the vague answers Lyra had prepared, and allowing herself, just slightly, to enjoy the strange unreality of the evening. It was during a lull in the receiving line, as Cale turned to speak with a visiting pack leader from the Northern Territories, that Elara noticed a man moving through the crowd with a purpose that did not match the celebratory mood around him. He wore the deep red colors of a minor noble house, his face unfamiliar among the guests she had been introduced to that evening, and his hand rested inside his cloak in a way that struck her as deliberately casual, the kind of casual a person performs when they do not want their true intentions noticed. She watched him for only a moment before her instincts, honed by years of navigating a village where danger often wore a friendly face, told her something was deeply wrong. The man was moving toward Cale's position at the edge of the crowd, his path calculated to intersect with the king's, just as the northern pack leader stepped away to rejoin his companions, leaving Cale momentarily alone. Elara did not think. She moved. She crossed the distance between them quickly, inserting herself into the space beside Cale, just as the man in red reached the same spot, and in doing so she saw, for just a fraction of a second, the glint of a blade sliding free from beneath his cloak. "My king," she said loudly, grabbing Cale's arm and pulling him half a step backward under the pretense of pointing toward something across the hall. "You must see this. It is remarkable." The sudden movement threw off the timing the man in red had clearly planned, and his strike, meant for Cale's exposed side, instead caught only air as Cale turned in response to Alara's tug on his arm. The blade flashed once more, and this time Cale's own reflexes, trained through years of leading his pack through danger, took over. He caught the man's wrist in an iron grip, twisting until the blade clattered to the marble floor, and within seconds, guards were surrounding the would-be attacker, dragging him away as the surrounding crowd erupted into shocked murmurs and cries. The hall fell into chaos for several long minutes, guards securing the exits, nobles pressing back against the walls, Lyra appearing at Alara's side so quickly it seemed she must have been watching the entire exchange from across the room. Cale stood at the center of it all, breathing hard, staring down at the fallen blade before his eyes lifted to find Alara. "You saw him before I did," he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear over the surrounding noise. "I did not think," Alara admitted, her hands still trembling with the aftershock of what had nearly happened. "I only moved." "That instinct saved my life," Cale said, and something in his expression, something that had been carefully guarded since the moment they met, shifted into an openness she had not seen from him before. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of guards questioning witnesses, and nobles whispering theories about who might have sent the attacker, though no answers emerged before the hall was finally cleared and the guests dispersed to their chambers under heavy escort. It was well past midnight when Alara found herself alone in her room, still wearing the formal dress from the announcement, staring at her own trembling hands, and trying to understand what had driven her to act so quickly to protect a man she barely knew. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened the door to find Cale standing in the corridor, no longer wearing his formal robes, his expression stripped of the composed authority he wore in public. "May I come in?" he asked, just for a moment. She stepped aside to let him enter, and he stood near the window, looking out at the dark courtyard below, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded her, suddenly, of a much younger man trying to appear older than he felt. "I have had many people pledge loyalty to me since I took the throne," he said, without turning around. "Advisors, guards, entire pack territories have sworn to protect me if the need ever arose. But tonight, in that hall, none of them moved before you did. You had no reason to protect me. Our arrangement does not require it, and yet you did not hesitate." "I do not know why I moved," Alara said honestly. "It was not a decision, it simply happened." Cale finally turned to face her, and in the low light of the room, she saw something in his eyes she had not expected to find there, a rawness that suggested the composed king she had met in her village was only one layer of a far more complicated man. "Thank you," he said simply, not as a king thanking a subject, but as a man thanking someone who chose to protect him when she owed him nothing beyond a contract. "You saved my father's home," Alara said. "I suppose I only returned the favor." "Perhaps," Cale said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe that explanation. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her, with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she found she could not. "I should let you rest," he said finally, moving toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, glancing back at her one more time. "I misjudged you. When we first met, I thought I was choosing someone who wanted nothing from this arrangement, someone who would remain distant and unaffected by anything that happened here. I am beginning to think I was wrong about that." He left before she could find a response, the door closing softly behind him, and Alara stood alone in the quiet room for a long time afterward, replaying the evening in her mind, the flash of the blade, the weight of his gratitude, the strange warmth that had settled in her chest, despite every instinct telling her to guard against it. She had come to Thornwood Castle, believing she could hold herself apart from all of it, complete the arrangement, and leave with her heart exactly as intact as it had been when she arrived. Standing at her window that night, watching the moon rise over the mountain peaks surrounding the castle, she began to suspect that promise to herself might be far harder to keep than she had first believed. Somewhere in the castle, guards were questioning the captured attacker, trying to determine who had sent him and why, and though no answers had yet emerged, Alara understood with unsettling clarity that whoever wanted Cale dead would not stop after a single failed attempt. The danger surrounding the throne was real, and having placed herself between Cale and that danger once already, she suspected the choice to do so again should the need arise, would come just as instinctively as it had tonight, regardless of what that instinct might cost her in the months ahead. The following morning brought a flurry of activity throughout the castle, guards doubling their rounds, advisors gathering in urgent hushed meetings, and Alara found herself summoned to the council chamber once more, this time not as an observer, but as a witness, whose account of the attack was needed, to help piece together exactly what had happened. She recounted the moment as clearly as she could, the strange stillness in the attacker's posture that had first drawn her attention, the glimpse of the blade beneath his cloak, the instinct that had sent her moving before conscious thought caught up with her body. The gathered advisors listened carefully, several exchanging glances that suggested her account confirmed suspicions they had already begun forming. The man carried no identification, and the poison that killed him in his cell was rare enough that only a handful of sources across the kingdom would have access to it, the silver-haired advisor said grimly. This was not a random act of violence. Someone with resources and patience orchestrated this, and orchestrated his silence just as carefully afterward. Duke Blackwood, Lyra said, though her voice carried more caution than certainty. He has motive, given the succession challenge, and he certainly has the resources, but accusing him without proof would be reckless, particularly given how carefully he has always distanced himself from anything that might be traced directly back to his hand. Cale's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the discussion, though Alara, who had begun to learn the small signs of tension he carried in his shoulders and jaw, could see the barely restrained anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. We move carefully, he said finally. Increase security throughout the castle, but we do not make public accusations without evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny before the full council. I will not hand Blackwood grounds to claim persecution when the spring session arrives. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing practical measures, additional guards for both Cale and Alara, closer monitoring of visitors to the castle, careful review of the kitchen and household staff to ensure no other threats had been quietly planted among them. Alara found the entire process both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure, grateful for the seriousness with which her safety was now being treated, yet increasingly aware of just how dangerous the world she had stepped into truly was. In the days that followed, she noticed a subtle shift in how the castle staff treated her, a new warmth replacing much of the earlier wariness, as word of her quick thinking during the attack spread through the halls in hushed, admiring tones. Even nobles who had regarded her with open suspicion during the announcement ceremony now offered cautious respect, understanding that whatever else she might be, she had proven herself willing to act decisively to protect their king when the moment demanded it. Alara found herself sitting with that shift uneasily, aware that the growing respect she had earned was built on an instinct she still did not fully understand, one that had nothing to do with careful political calculation and everything to do with something deeper that had already begun taking root in her heart, though she was not yet ready to examine that feeling too closely, not while the danger surrounding the throne remained so immediate and unresolved. The captured attacker gave up no names before he died in his cell 3 days later, poisoned by someone who had access to the castle dungeons, which told Cale and his advisors everything they needed to know about how serious and well-organized the threat against him truly was. Whoever had sent the man in red had allies close enough to the throne to silence him before he could speak, and that realization settled over the castle like a heavy fog that no amount of daylight seemed able to burn away. Alara found herself drawn into the security discussions that followed, not because anyone believed she had useful political insight, but because she had been the one to notice the danger before anyone else in the room, and Cale had begun, cautiously, to value her instincts in ways that surprised even his closest advisors. We need clear boundaries, Cale said one evening, as they walked together through the castle gardens under the pretense of an evening stroll that would be witnessed by enough servants and guards to reinforce the story of their engagement. For the arrangement to hold, and for both of us to remain safe from whatever complications might arise, I think it is wise that we establish rules. What kind of rules? Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew. No real affection, Cale said, counting the terms off as though he had rehearsed them. Whatever happens between us in public must remain a performance. Separate chambers, as we already have. No expectations beyond what is necessary to maintain the appearance of our engagement. When the year ends, we part cleanly, without complication on either side. Alara nodded, though something in his careful listing of rules felt less like practical wisdom, and more like a wall being built brick by brick, around a man who had already shown her, if only briefly, what lay behind that wall. Agreed, she said. Rules are wise, given everything happening around us. They shook on it, formally, as though sealing a business contract, rather than the strange, complicated arrangement that had already grown into something neither of them had originally intended. And for a while, the rules held. They spent their days maintaining careful distance in private, while in public, at council meetings and formal dinners and the occasional visiting dignitary's reception, they performed the role of a devoted couple, with a skill that surprised even Lyra, who had expected far more mistakes from an outsider unfamiliar with court life. But proximity, Elara was beginning to learn, had a way of eroding even the most carefully constructed rules. Small moments accumulated between them despite their best efforts, a shared laugh over a servant's clumsy joke during dinner, a quiet conversation about the mountains surrounding the castle that stretched far longer than either of them intended, an evening spent in the library when a sudden storm trapped them both indoors and Cale, without quite meaning to, told her more about his childhood than he had told anyone in years. It was during one of these unplanned conversations, weeks after the failed attack in the Great Hall, that Elara finally asked the question she had been holding back since her first evening in the castle. "Tell me about your brother," she said. They were sitting in the library, rain drumming steadily against the tall windows, a fire crackling in the hearth nearby. Cale's expression shifted immediately, the easy warmth of moments before replaced by something guarded and distant. "Petra told you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Only fragments," Elara said. "I would rather hear it from you, if you are willing to share it." For a long moment, she thought he would refuse, would retreat behind the same walls he had built around every part of himself that mattered. But then he set down the book he had been holding and stared into the fire, and slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. "Ronan was 2 years older than me," he said. "Our father always intended for him to take the throne. I was meant to lead the western border patrols, a position with less weight, less expectation. I was content with that arrangement. Ronan was born to lead, the way some people are simply born knowing how to carry a room full of expectations without breaking under the pressure. I never wanted the crown." He fell silent for a moment, and Elara did not push him, understanding instinctively that some stories needed space to breathe before they could be told in full. "5 years ago, a border skirmish broke out with a rival territory," he continued eventually. "Ronan was meant to lead our forces to defend the eastern settlements. I was meant to accompany him, as I always did. But I had fallen ill with a fever days before, bad enough that Petra confined me to bed against my own protests. Ronan went without me." His hands tightened into fists against his knees, and Elara watched the muscles in his jaw work as he forced himself to continue. "He did not return," Cale said simply. "The skirmish turned into something larger than anyone anticipated, and Ronan died defending a settlement that should have had both of us there to protect it. I have spent every day since wondering whether the outcome would have been different if I had been standing beside him, instead of lying useless in a sickbed while he faced that battle alone." "That is not your fault," Elara said, gently but firmly. "You could not control your own illness. You did not choose to be absent." "I know that, in my mind," Cale said, "but knowing something and feeling it are not the same thing. I became king a year sooner than anyone expected, thrust into a role I never trained for, carrying a crown that should have belonged to my brother, and every decision I have made since has been shadowed by the certainty that I am simply not the king he would have been." Elara felt something tighten in her chest, watching him carry this weight so openly for the first time since they had met. She reached out, almost without thinking, and placed her hand over his clenched fist, feeling the tension there slowly begin to ease beneath her touch. "I did not know your brother," she said. "But I know that a kingdom does not run smoothly by accident. I have watched you these past months, in council meetings and public ceremonies, and quiet conversations like this one. You carry this crown with more care and more thought than most men would manage in a lifetime. Whatever kind of king your brother might have been, I do not believe he could have done better than the king you have already become." Cale looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made the careful rules they had established weeks earlier feel suddenly, dangerously fragile. The firelight caught the sincerity in her expression, and something in his own face softened in response. The guarded distance he maintained so carefully in every other moment of his life, quietly dissolving between them. "You are not what I expected, when I found you in that village," he said quietly. I thought I was choosing someone to solve a political problem. I did not expect to find someone who could see past the crown to the man underneath it. Perhaps that is exactly why the arrangement is working, Elara said, though her voice had grown softer than she intended, the careful distance she had also promised to maintain, slipping further away with every passing moment in the firelit room. They sat together for a long while after that, neither speaking, simply existing in the quiet comfort of shared understanding, the storm outside gradually softening into a gentle rain. It was, Elara would later realize, the moment the rules they had established began to crumble in earnest, though neither of them acknowledged it aloud that night, both too wary of what such an acknowledgement might mean for an arrangement built entirely on the promise of remaining temporary and uncomplicated. She returned to her own chamber long after midnight, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, the rawness in his voice when he spoke of his brother, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her afterward. She had told herself, over and over since arriving at the castle, that she could complete this arrangement with her heart fully guarded, that a year would pass and she would leave exactly as unaffected as when she came. Lying in the darkness that night, listening to the last of the storm fade into silence outside her window, she understood with growing certainty that this particular promise to herself had already begun slipping through her fingers, one quiet conversation at a time, and she had no idea, yet, how to stop it. In the days that followed, she found herself paying closer attention to the small ways Cale carried his brother's memory through his daily life, details she had overlooked before their conversation in the library, but now noticed everywhere she looked. A worn leather bracelet he wore beneath his formal sleeves, which Petra later told her had belonged to Ronan. The particular care he took when discussing the eastern settlements during council meetings, as though every decision touching that region carried an extra weight of memory. The way he sometimes paused, mid-conversation, his eyes drifting toward some middle distance, before catching himself and returning fully to the present moment. She did not mention these observations aloud, understanding instinctively that some griefs needed to be witnessed quietly, rather than commented upon directly, but she began finding small ways to offer comfort regardless, sitting with him during those pensive moments, rather than filling the silence with unnecessary words, matching her pace to his during their evening walks, rather than rushing him toward conversation he was not yet ready to have. Cale noticed the shift in her presence, the quiet steadiness she offered without demanding explanation, and it seemed to loosen something further in him with each passing week. He began seeking her out more often, not only during the required public appearances that maintained their arrangement's credibility, but during ordinary moments throughout the day, a shared cup of tea in the early morning before the castle fully woke, a brief conversation exchanged in a hallway between meetings, small accumulations of time that neither of them acknowledged as significant, though both were quietly aware of how much they had begun to look forward to them. One afternoon, several weeks after their conversation about Ronan, Cale surprised her by asking if she would like to see the training grounds where he had once practiced alongside his brother as a boy, a request that carried more vulnerability than its simple wording suggested. Elara agreed without hesitation, and he led her through a lesser-used section of the castle grounds to a wide, sunlit field, where wooden practice weapons still hung along one weathered fence, relics of a childhood spent preparing for a future neither brother had fully anticipated. "We used to spar here every morning before our lessons began," Cale said, running his hand along the worn wood of the fence. "Ronan always won, though he claimed afterward that he let me score a few strikes to keep my confidence intact. I never quite believed him, but I appreciated the kindness of the lie. You do not come here often," Elara observed, noting the slightly overgrown grass, the general sense of a space visited rarely rather than regularly. "I have not stood in this field since before he died," Cale admitted. "I am not entirely certain why I brought you here today, except that it felt, somehow, like something I wanted to share with you, rather than something I wanted to continue avoiding." Elara reached for his hand, feeling the slight tension in his fingers gradually ease beneath her touch, and they stood together in the quiet field for a long while, sunlight filtering through the surrounding trees, the ordinary sounds of the castle's daily life carrying faintly from beyond the tree line. It was, she realized later, one of the first moments where the careful rules they had established truly began to feel insufficient to contain what was actually growing between them, though neither spoke that realization aloud, both still cautious of naming something that felt, in its early stages, almost too fragile to survive being spoken into the open air. Duke Ransom Blackwood arrived at Thornwood Castle, unannounced, on a grey afternoon 3 months after the engagement had been made public, riding through the gates with a small entourage and a smile that fooled no one familiar with his reputation. Lyra found Elara in the garden within minutes of his arrival, her expression tight with the kind of controlled alarm that immediately put Elara on edge. "Blackwood is here," Lyra said. "He claims he simply wished to offer his congratulations in person, but he has never once in 5 years done anything without a calculated reason behind it. Stay close to the king this evening, and say as little as possible." The dinner that followed was one of the tensest evenings Elara had experienced since arriving at the castle, though on the surface it appeared perfectly civil. Blackwood sat across the table, a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing, complimenting the food, praising the castle's renovations, and asking pointed questions about Elara's family history that she answered with the careful, vague responses Lyra had spent months drilling into her. "Forgive my curiosity," Blackwood said at one point, setting down his wineglass with deliberate care, "but I find it strange that a woman capable of catching the eye of an Alpha King has left almost no trace among the border villages. My own people searched for records of your family and found remarkably little." "My family has always kept to themselves," Elara said smoothly, exactly as she had practiced. "We are simple people, Duke Blackwood. There was little reason for anyone to keep detailed records of us before the king honored us with his attention." Blackwood's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes sharpened, and Elara understood, with a cold certainty, that he did not believe her, not entirely, and that he would not stop looking until he found the cracks he suspected were there. He left the following morning, but not before requesting, and receiving, permission to leave one of his attendants behind, as a gesture of goodwill, a young woman named Nora Finch, who would supposedly assist with preparations for the upcoming wedding ceremony. Lyra protested the arrangement privately, certain that Nora was nothing more than a spy planted to gather information, but Cale, wary of provoking open conflict before the spring council session, allowed the arrangement to stand, insisting that careful management would keep any real secrets safely hidden. Elara, unaware of the full extent of the danger Nora represented, found herself unexpectedly drawn to the young woman over the following weeks. Nora was warm and quick-witted, with an easy laugh that made the tense atmosphere of the castle feel briefly lighter, and she asked none of the probing political questions Elara had braced herself to deflect. Instead, their conversations wandered towards simpler subjects: favorite foods, childhood memories, the strange customs of court life that both of them, coming from more modest backgrounds, found equally bewildering. "I never expected to make a friend here," Elara admitted one afternoon, as they sat together in the castle's smaller garden, away from the more formal spaces where nobles gathered to gossip and observe. "Everyone else watches me like I might disappear the moment they look away, or worse, like I might expose some secret they have already decided I am hiding." "Perhaps they simply do not know you yet," Nora said, her tone gentle, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes that Elara, caught up in the comfort of an unexpected friendship, did not notice. What Elara could not have known was that every detail she shared during these quiet conversations, however innocent it seemed, was being carefully recorded and passed along through a network of messengers back to Duke Blackwood's territory. Nora had been trained for years in the art of gathering information, without seeming to gather it at all, and Elara's guarded loneliness in the unfamiliar castle made her an easier target than either Lyra or Cale had anticipated. Lyra's suspicions deepened over the following weeks, though she struggled to find concrete evidence of wrongdoing. She began watching Nora more closely, noting the timing of her private letters, the careful way she positioned herself near important conversations, without appearing to eavesdrop, and eventually brought her concerns directly to Cale. "I do not trust her," Lyra said, during a private meeting in the king's study. "She is too skilled at appearing harmless, and Elara has grown close to her far too quickly." "You suspect Elara of sharing secrets deliberately," Cale said, his tone sharper than Lyra had expected. "No," Lyra admitted. "I suspect Elara does not fully understand the danger of speaking freely in this castle. She was not raised in a world where kindness is often a tool for extracting information. I do not blame her for trusting someone who seems trustworthy. But I think we need to be far more careful about what reaches Nora's ears, and I think Elara deserves to know the truth about who she has been confiding in." Cale considered this for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect Elara from unnecessary worry and his growing understanding that keeping her in the dark had already led to complications neither of them had anticipated. He found her that evening in the library, curled in a chair near the fire, with a book she was not truly reading, and sat down across from her, with an expression that immediately told her something serious had prompted the visit. "I need to speak with you about Nora," he said. Elara's stomach tightened at the careful way he chose his words. "What about her?" "Lyra believes she has been gathering information to send back to Blackwood," Cale said gently. "I do not yet have proof strong enough to confront her directly, but the pattern of her behavior is troubling enough that I think you should be cautious about what you share with her going forward." The words landed like a physical blow. Elara thought back over every conversation she had shared with Nora, every small detail about her past, her feelings, her growing confusion about her relationship with Cale, wondering with growing horror how much of it might have already made its way back to a man actively seeking to destroy everything Cale had built. "I told her things," Elara said quietly, her voice tight with dawning realization. "Nothing about the arrangement itself. I was careful about that, but personal things. Things about how I feel about being here. About you." Cale's expression softened slightly at the vulnerability in her admission, though the concern in his eyes did not fade. "That is not your fault. She is skilled at what she does, skilled enough that even Lyra only recently grew certain of her intentions. But I need you to be more guarded, at least until we understand exactly how much damage may already be done." Elara nodded, though the sting of betrayal sat heavy in her chest, made heavier by the realization that she had allowed herself to be vulnerable with someone who had likely never intended anything but manipulation from the very beginning. It was a painful lesson in a castle full of them, a reminder that even small comforts could not be trusted at face value within these walls, and that every relationship she built here carried risks she had not fully understood when she agreed to this arrangement months earlier. That night, as she prepared for bed, she found herself replaying every conversation with Nora, searching for moments where she might have revealed something dangerous, something that could be twisted and used against Cale when the Spring Council finally convened. She did not yet know how much damage had already been done, or how quickly Blackwood would move to use whatever information he had gathered, but the uneasy feeling settling in her chest told her that whatever came next would test the fragile trust she and Cale had begun building far more severely than anything that had come before it. The following days passed with a strange, careful tension threaded through every interaction. Nora continued her duties as though nothing had changed, her warmth and easy laughter as convincing as ever, and Elara found herself forced into an uncomfortable performance of her own, maintaining the appearance of friendship while guarding every word she spoke, with far more caution than before. It was exhausting in a way that court politics had not yet managed to be, the constant vigilance required to smile genuinely at someone she now suspected of working against everything she had come to care about within these castle walls. Lyra, meanwhile, worked quietly to gather concrete evidence, reviewing the castle's messenger logs, questioning kitchen staff about unusual visitors, tracing the paths of letters that left the castle under Nora's supervision. It was slow, careful work, complicated by the need to avoid alerting Nora that suspicion had fallen upon her before they had gathered enough proof to act decisively. "I found something," Lyra told Cale and Elara one evening, gathering them privately in the king's study, her expression grim with the weight of what she had uncovered. A pattern of letters sent under the guise of correspondence with her family, but addressed to a location within Blackwood's territory, rather than her stated home village. The timing aligns precisely with several of her conversations with Elara, details about the castle's security arrangements, and about the growing affection between the two of you appearing in Blackwood's awareness far too quickly to be coincidental. The confirmation, though expected, still landed heavily. Elara felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her, replaying every warm conversation she had shared with Nora, wondering how much of what she believed to be genuine friendship had, in truth, only ever been careful, calculated extraction. "We cannot confront her directly, not yet," Cale said, his jaw tight with restrained anger. "If we expose our knowledge too soon, Blackwood will simply adjust his strategy, and we lose whatever advantage we currently hold in understanding what he already knows. For now, we continue as though nothing has changed, while ensuring nothing of true value reaches her ears going forward." It was a difficult strategy to maintain, requiring Elara to continue a friendship she now understood to be entirely false, smiling and laughing through conversations that had once brought her genuine comfort in an unfamiliar world. now hollowed out by the knowledge of betrayal lurking beneath every exchange. She found herself leaning more heavily on her growing closeness with Chaol during this period, grateful for at least one relationship within the castle walls she could trust completely, even as the political dangers surrounding them both continued to deepen with every passing week. Petra, sensing her distress during one of their evening visits, offered what comfort she could. "Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes wrapped in kindness," she said, continuing her steady work with the herbs spread across her table. "But do not let it convince you that all kindness within these walls is false. You have found genuine allies here too, myself included, even if the path to finding them required learning some harder lessons along the way." Elara took what comfort she could from those words, though the wound of Nora's betrayal lingered, a quiet ache that colored her remaining weeks at court, with a wariness she had not carried before, a hard, learned caution that would serve her well in the more dangerous days still waiting ahead. Something had changed in Chaol since the discovery about Nora, though it took Elara several days to understand exactly what it was. He had always carried himself with careful control, every movement and expression measured, but now she noticed small moments where that control seemed to slip. A sharp intake of breath when she entered a room unexpectedly, a lingering glance that lasted a beat too long before he caught himself and looked away. Petra was the one who finally explained it to her, during one of their now regular evening visits to the healer's quarters, where Elara had taken to helping sort dried herbs while they talked, a simple task that gave her hands something to do, while her mind worked through the growing complexities of her situation. "You have noticed the change in him," Petra said, not quite a question, as she measured out portions of dried chamomile into small linen pouches. "I have," Elara admitted. "He seems more guarded than usual, and yet somehow less able to hide certain things. I do not understand it." Petra set down her work and studied Elara with the patient expression of someone who had watched this particular pattern unfold many times before, in many different pairs, across many years of tending to the royal family. "There is a bond that forms between mates in our kind," Petra said carefully. "Not always at first meeting, though sometimes it happens that quickly. More often it builds slowly, through shared experience and growing trust, until the wolf recognizes something the mind has not yet consciously accepted. Chaol's wolf has been reacting to you for some time now, I suspect, though he has fought against acknowledging it." Elara's hands stilled over the herbs, her heart suddenly beating faster. "You believe he sees me as his mate?" "I believe his wolf does," Petra said. "Whether the man himself is ready to accept that is a different question entirely. Chaol has spent 5 years building walls around his heart, convinced that allowing himself to want something too deeply only invites loss. His brother's death taught him that lesson far too young, and far too harshly. A mate bond is not something he can simply decide to ignore, but it is also not something he will accept easily, not after everything he has survived." The words settled over Elara with a weight she had not expected, stirring feelings she had been carefully trying to suppress since that rainy evening in the library weeks earlier. She thought of the way Chaol's eyes tracked her movements across a room, the way his voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever he spoke to her in private, the careful distance he maintained that seemed less like disinterest and more like a man holding himself back from something he desperately wanted, but did not trust himself to reach for. She began to notice it more clearly after that conversation. Small signs she had previously dismissed as simple courtesy, or the natural warmth that had grown between them during months of shared performance. The way he positioned himself near her at gatherings, angled slightly protective, even when no threat was present. The low, almost involuntary sound that sometimes escaped him when she laughed at something unexpected. The tension that visibly eased from his shoulders whenever she entered a room he was already in, as though some part of him had been holding its breath until she arrived. One evening, several weeks after her conversation with Petra, Elara witnessed the clearest sign yet of the internal battle Chaol was fighting against himself. They had been walking together through the castle's eastern hallway, discussing preparations for an upcoming diplomatic visit, when a young nobleman approached from the opposite direction, greeting Elara with a warm smile and an overly familiar compliment about how well the role of future queen suited her. It was a harmless enough exchange, the kind of flattery Elara had grown accustomed to deflecting gracefully during her months at court, but she felt Chaol go rigid beside her, watched his jaw tighten, and his eyes narrow, with an intensity that startled the young nobleman into a hasty, awkward retreat. That was unnecessary, Ilara said once they were alone again, though she could not entirely suppress the small, curious smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. He stood too close, Cale said, his voice tighter than the situation warranted, his hands still curled into loose fists at his sides. He offered a compliment, Ilara said, nothing more. Cale did not respond immediately, and when she glanced up at him, she saw an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and almost pained beneath the careful composure he usually maintained. I do not know what is happening to me, he admitted quietly, so quietly she nearly missed it. I find myself reacting to things I have no right to react to. This arrangement was meant to remain simple, contained. And yet lately I find myself feeling things I promised myself I would not allow, watching you with an intensity I cannot fully explain or control. Ilara's breath caught in her chest at the unexpected vulnerability in his admission. Perhaps, she said carefully, you do not need to fully explain it. Perhaps it is enough to simply acknowledge that it exists. It is not that simple, Cale said, and something in his tone carried the weight of old grief, resurfacing beneath new feeling. Every time I allow myself to want something, I risk losing it. I have already lost my brother because I was not there when he needed me most. I do not know if I can survive risking that kind of loss again, especially not with someone I chose to bring into this danger deliberately, someone whose safety I am directly responsible for. You did not choose to bring danger into my life, Ilara said gently, closing the small distance between them. I chose to walk into this castle knowing the risks. Whatever grows between us, whatever this bond your wolf seems intent on recognizing might mean, it is not a burden you carry alone. I am here by choice, and I intend to remain here by choice, regardless of the danger surrounding us both. Cale's eyes searched her face for a long moment, and Ilara watched the internal battle play out clearly across his features, the desperate wish to believe her words warring against years of carefully constructed self-protection. He did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before. I am not ready to name what this is, he said. Not yet. There is too much at stake, too much danger surrounding us both, and I fear that acknowledging it fully might make it harder to protect you, if the worst should come to pass. But I want you to know that I see it too. Whatever is growing between us, I am not blind to it, even if I am not yet brave enough to fully embrace it. It was not a declaration, not the kind of clear confession Ilara might have once hoped for in simpler circumstances, but it was honest, raw, in a way that carried more weight than any polished speech could have managed, and Ilara found herself accepting it as exactly what it was, a fragile, tentative acknowledgement from a man still learning how to trust his own heart again, after years of guarding it too carefully. They stood together in the quiet hallway for a long moment, neither speaking further, simply allowing the unspoken truth between them to settle into something neither of them was yet ready to fully claim. And though the danger surrounding the throne, and Blackwood's growing suspicions, and the spy still gathering information within the castle walls had not disappeared, Ilara found, standing there in the fading evening light, that for the first time since arriving at Thornwood Castle, she did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever challenges still waited ahead. In the weeks that followed, small moments continued accumulating between them, each one a quiet acknowledgement of the bond neither was yet ready to name aloud. She noticed how his wolf seemed to respond to her presence, even when Cale himself remained carefully composed, a low warmth in his eyes, that Petra had explained was simply the animal recognizing what the man was still learning to accept. During council meetings, she found him glancing toward her more often than strict necessity required, as though checking, almost unconsciously, that she remained safely within his sight. One evening, a visiting delegation from a southern territory hosted a small celebration in the castle's grand hall, and Ilara found herself swept into a dance she had not properly learned, stumbling through the unfamiliar steps until Cale appeared at her side, guiding her with a patience that drew admiring glances from the watching nobility. His hand rested warm against her waist, his other hand holding hers, with a gentleness that felt entirely different from the formal, distant courtesy he had once maintained so carefully. You are better at this than you pretend to be, she teased quietly, as they moved together across the polished floor. I had a very determined teacher once, Cale said, a rare smile touching his lips. Ronan insisted every future king needed to dance well enough not to embarrass the crown at diplomatic gatherings. I resented the lessons at the time. I am grateful for them now, if only because they give me an excuse to hold you like this, without anyone questioning the reason. Elara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, at the easy admission of wanting closeness that would have been unthinkable from the guarded man she had first met in her village months earlier. The dance ended too soon, and though propriety demanded they separate to greet other guests, she found her gaze returning to him throughout the remainder of the evening, and each time, she found his eyes already waiting to meet hers. Later that night, walking her back to her chambers through the quiet, torch-lit corridors, Kale paused outside her door longer than strictly necessary, neither of them quite ready to end the evening despite the late hour. I keep telling myself I should maintain more distance, he admitted quietly, that the rules we agreed upon exist for good reason, that allowing myself to want this, whatever this has become, only invites complications neither of us planned for when this arrangement began. And yet you are still standing here, Elara said softly, long past the point where saying goodnight would have been simple enough. Yes, Kale said, something rueful and honest in his expression. It seems I am not as disciplined as I once believed myself to be. At least, not where you are concerned. He left shortly after, with nothing more than a lingering glance and a soft goodnight, but Elara stood at her window long after his footsteps faded down the corridor, watching the moon rise over the mountains, feeling the quiet, undeniable truth of what was growing between them settle more firmly into her heart with every passing day. The spring council session arrived faster than anyone at Thornwood Castle felt prepared for, and Elara found herself standing beside Kale in the grand assembly hall of the capital, facing rows of pack leaders and territorial representatives who had gathered from across the kingdom to review the succession laws and settle any outstanding disputes before the new season began. She had spent the previous week rehearsing every possible question she might face, memorizing the finer points of pack law that Lyra insisted she understand before stepping into a room this dangerous. Duke Blackwood sat near the front of the assembly, dressed in formal robes of deep burgundy, his expression carrying the calm satisfaction of a man who believed he already held a winning hand. Elara felt a chill settle over her the moment their eyes met across the crowded hall, and she understood, with sudden certainty, that whatever Nora had gathered during her weeks at the castle was about to be used against them in this very room. The session opened with routine matters, border adjustments, trade agreements between neighboring territories, minor disputes that were settled quickly through established precedent. Elara began to relax slightly as the morning wore on without incident, until Blackwood rose from his seat during a pause between agenda items, requesting formal recognition to address the assembly on a matter of, as he called it, considerable importance to the stability of the crown. I congratulate King Kale on his upcoming marriage, Blackwood began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, pitched for maximum effect. A union that conveniently arrived just months before this very council session, silencing any question of succession challenges before they could properly begin. I find myself curious, however, about the nature of this remarkably timely engagement. A ripple of murmurs moved through the assembled crowd, and Elara felt Kale's hand find hers beneath the edge of the table where they sat, his grip steady despite the tension she could feel radiating from him. I have made inquiries into Lady Elara's background, Blackwood continued, and found troublingly little history to support the depth of affection this court has been asked to believe exists between them. No prior courtship, no family connections to speak of within pack circles. A woman who appeared, quite suddenly, from an obscure border village, at precisely the moment such an arrangement would prove politically convenient. Are you accusing your king of dishonesty before this council? Kale said, rising to his feet, his voice carrying the sharp edge of controlled fury that made the entire hall fall silent. Choose your next words carefully, Blackwood. I accuse no one of anything, Blackwood said smoothly, though his smile suggested otherwise. I simply ask the council to consider the timing, and to require proof, as is our right under ancient law, that this union is genuine, rather than a political convenience, designed to circumvent legitimate succession challenges. The demand hung in the air, and Elara felt every eye in the hall turn toward them, waiting to see how Kale would respond to a challenge that struck directly at the fragile foundation their entire arrangement had been built upon. She glanced at Lyra, seated nearby, whose expression had gone carefully blank in the way it always did when she was scrambling to find a solution to an unexpected crisis. Cale did not hesitate. He turned to face Alara directly, and something in his eyes carried a certainty that startled her, a resolve that seemed to settle over him like armor, as he made his decision in real time before the entire assembly. "There is no timing convenient enough to fabricate what exists between us," he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, though his eyes remained fixed on Alara alone. "I did not simply choose Alara Voss for political convenience. My wolf recognized her the moment I found her, though I was too guarded, too afraid of loss, to admit it even to myself. She is not merely my intended bride, Duke Blackwood. She is my true mate, and I will not stand here and allow her worth, or the truth of what we share, to be questioned before this council." The words landed with a force that stunned the entire hall into silence, and Alara felt her own breath catch, uncertain in that moment whether Cale's declaration was purely strategic, a desperate move to silence Blackwood's challenge, or something deeper, something he had finally allowed himself to voice aloud, after weeks of careful, guarded acknowledgement between them in private. Blackwood's confident expression flickered, clearly unprepared for such a direct and public claim. Under ancient pack law, a declared true mate bond carried weight that a simple political marriage did not. Protections and recognitions that would be far more difficult to challenge through legal maneuvering alone. "A bold claim," Blackwood said, recovering his composure quickly. "One that should be simple enough to verify, if it is genuine. A true mate bond carries physical markers, recognizable to any experienced healer. I would ask that the council require such verification before accepting this claim as sufficient grounds to dismiss my concerns." Murmurs of agreement moved through parts of the assembly, and Alara felt panic rising in her chest. She did not know whether the bond Cale had just declared publicly was fully formed, whether it would show the physical markers Blackwood was demanding, or whether this desperate declaration, made to protect them both in a moment of crisis, might instead expose the very fabrication Blackwood had been searching for all along. Petra rose from her seat before anyone else could respond, her voice carrying the quiet authority of decades spent as the royal healer, respected by every pack leader present, regardless of political alliance. "I have observed the developing bond between King Cale and Lady Alara over recent months," she said. "The markers are present, though still forming, which is entirely consistent with a genuine bond still solidifying between two people who have only recently allowed themselves to acknowledge it. I would stake my own reputation on the truth of this claim." It was not quite the full verification Blackwood had demanded, but Petra's respected standing among the assembly carried enough weight to shift the room's mood, murmurs of skepticism giving way to cautious acceptance among many of the gathered representatives. Blackwood, sensing the tide turning against him, retreated to more measured objections, though the fire of his earlier confidence had visibly dimmed. The council session continued for another hour, working through the formal procedures required to close the succession question definitively, but Alara barely registered the details, her mind still reeling from Cale's public declaration and the uncertain truth behind it. When the session finally adjourned, and they were escorted back to their private chambers within the capital's guest quarters, the silence between them carried a weight neither seemed ready to break. "Was that true?" Alara finally asked, once the door had closed behind them, and they stood alone for the first time since the assembly. "What you said, about the bond? Or was it only strategy, to silence Blackwood's challenge?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that carried none of the careful distance he had maintained during their earliest weeks together. "I meant every word," he said finally. "I have been fighting the truth of it for months, telling myself it was too dangerous to acknowledge, too great a risk, given everything happening around us. But standing in that hall, faced with the possibility of losing you to Blackwood's manipulations, I understood that hiding from the truth any longer would cost me something I am no longer willing to lose." Alara felt something inside her chest finally loosen, weeks of carefully guarded feeling breaking free all at once. "I have felt it too," she admitted. "Since that night in the library, perhaps even before that, though I told myself it was foolish to hope for something real, growing out of an arrangement built on pretense. Perhaps it was never entirely pretense," Cale said quietly, closing the distance between them. "Perhaps some part of both of us recognized something true from the very beginning, long before either of us was ready to admit it. The danger from Blackwood had not disappeared, and the political consequences of his public declaration would surely ripple through the court in the weeks ahead. But standing together in the quiet chamber, with the truth finally spoken openly between them, Ilara felt something shift permanently in the fragile arrangement that had brought them together. A shift that neither Blackwood's suspicions nor the uncertain dangers still ahead could fully undo. News of the declaration reached beyond the capital within days, carried by merchants and travelers who had witnessed the assembly firsthand, and Ilara found herself the subject of considerable curiosity throughout the kingdom. Stories of the true mate bond growing more elaborate with every retelling. Some versions claim she had saved the king from 3 separate attempts on his life. Others insisted she had known him since childhood, their bond simply hidden from the court until circumstances forced its revelation. She found the exaggerations both amusing and unsettling, a reminder of how quickly ordinary truth could transform into legend once it left the hands of those who had actually lived it. Lyra approached her the morning after their return to the capital's guest quarters, her expression carrying none of the earlier suspicion that had once colored every interaction between them. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble. "I doubted your intentions from the moment you arrived, certain you could not possibly understand the weight of what you had agreed to, or the danger it would bring to the king's door. I see now that I misjudged you badly." "You had good reason for caution," Ilara said. "You were protecting someone you care for deeply. I cannot fault you for that, even if it made my early weeks here more difficult." "Perhaps," Lyra said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her usually guarded expression. "But I think, going forward, I would rather be your ally than your obstacle. If what grows between you and Kale is even half as real as what I witnessed in that assembly hall, then you deserve better than my suspicions standing in the way of it." The shift in Lyra's attitude marked a turning point in how the wider court began treating Ilara as well, the careful watchfulness of her earliest weeks gradually giving way to genuine warmth, though she remained aware that Blackwood's allies within the nobility would continue watching for any opportunity to reignite the challenge he had suffered before the full council. That evening, before they departed the capital to return to Thornwood Castle, Kale arranged a quiet dinner for just the two of them, away from the formal gatherings that had consumed so much of their time during the council session. "I meant to ask you something," before Blackwood's challenge interrupted everything, he said, as they sat together in the small private dining room. "I want to know, now that the truth is spoken openly between us, what you actually want from this arrangement going forward. Not what circumstance has forced upon us, but what you would choose, if the choice were entirely your own." Ilara considered the question carefully, aware of how much weight it carried. "I did not expect to find anything real here," she admitted. "I came to Thornwood Castle believing I was simply completing a transaction, a year of pretense, in exchange for my father's safety. I did not expect to find myself caring for the man I was meant to be pretending to love, but I do care for you, Kale, more than I believed possible when this began. I do not yet know what that means for the year ahead, but I know I no longer wish for it to end as cleanly as we once planned." Kale reached across the table, taking her hand in his expression carrying a warmth that had grown steadily more open since his declaration before the council. "Then let us discover what it means together," he said, "one day at a time, without the pressure of rules that no longer serve the truth we have finally allowed ourselves to acknowledge." Word of Kale's public declaration spread through the capital within days, and by the time they returned to Thornwood Castle, the story had already transformed into something larger than the truth itself. Whispered accounts of a fierce and sudden true mate bond between the Alpha King and the mysterious woman from the border villages. Ilara found the attention overwhelming at first, servants and nobles alike regarding her now with open curiosity, rather than the guarded suspicion she had grown used to, though she noticed Lyra remained watchful, unwilling to fully relax despite the apparent victory over Blackwood's challenge. "He will not simply accept defeat," Lyra warned, during a private meeting shortly after their return. "Blackwood has spent years building toward this challenge. A single setback in the council hall will not be enough to make him abandon his ambitions entirely. We need to remain vigilant, particularly regarding Nora, who I still believe has been feeding him information throughout her time here." Kale agreed, ordering increased security throughout the castle, and quietly beginning an investigation into exactly what information might have already reached Blackwood's hands through his planted spy. But even amid these ongoing concerns, something had genuinely shifted between Ilara and Kale, the careful distance they had maintained for months, finally giving way to something warmer, more honest, built on the foundation of truth spoken aloud before the entire council. They spent their evenings together now without the pretense that had once governed every interaction, walking through the castle gardens simply because they enjoyed each other's company, rather than because appearances required it, sharing meals in quiet corners away from the formal dining hall, where conversation could flow freely, without careful performance for watching eyes. It was during one of these quieter evenings, several weeks after their return from the capital, that Elara suffered a minor injury while helping Petra prepare supplies in the healer's quarters, a careless slip with a small blade used for cutting herbs that left a shallow cut across her palm. It was nothing serious, the kind of small accident that happened easily enough during routine work. But when Cale arrived at the healer's quarters shortly after, drawn by some instinct she was beginning to understand was tied to the bond between them, his reaction carried far more alarm than the minor wound warranted. "You are bleeding," he said, crossing the room in quick strides, taking her injured hand carefully in both of his own, examining the small cut with an intensity that made Elara smile, despite the slight sting of the wound. "It is only a scratch," she assured him. "Petra was already treating it before you arrived." "I felt something," Cale admitted, still holding her hand gently, his thumb tracing carefully around the edges of the small bandage Petra had just finished applying. "A sudden pull of concern, strong enough that I left the council meeting I was in, without fully explaining why. I did not know something had actually happened, until I arrived here, and saw the blood." Petra, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction, offered an explanation that carried the weight of long experience. "That is the bond continuing to strengthen," she said. "It is not uncommon for mates to sense distress in one another, even minor distress like this, particularly as the connection between them deepens. I suspect you will find that sensation growing stronger in the months ahead, for both of you." The revelation settled into something between them that evening, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever connection had begun forming between them was continuing to grow, deepening beyond anything either of them had originally anticipated when this arrangement first began. Cale insisted on personally seeing her back to her chambers that night, and lingered at her door far longer than either of them acknowledged aloud, neither quite ready to end the evening despite the late hour. "I want to tell you something," Cale said finally, standing in the doorway, his expression carrying a vulnerability that had become increasingly familiar over recent weeks. "Something I have not spoken of since my brother died, something I think you deserve to understand fully, given everything we now share." Elara stepped aside to let him into her chamber, settling into the chairs near her small hearth as he gathered his thoughts, the fire casting warm light across features that carried both old grief and something new, something gentler, that had not been present in their earliest conversations. "After Ronan died, I convinced myself that caring too deeply for anyone was a kind of danger I could not afford," Cale said. "I watched what his loss did to our parents, watched my mother grieve until it hollowed her out completely, watched my father throw himself into ruling the kingdom simply to avoid feeling anything at all. I decided, quite deliberately, that I would rule differently, that I would keep myself guarded enough that no loss could ever hollow me out the same way. That is why the rules mattered so much to you," Elara said softly, understanding settling over her. "Not because you did not feel anything, but because you were afraid of what feeling too much might eventually cost you." "Yes," Cale admitted. "And then you arrived, and every careful wall I had built began falling apart, despite my best efforts to maintain them. I fought it longer than I should have, told myself repeatedly that acknowledging what was growing between us would only invite the kind of loss I had spent 5 years protecting myself against. But watching you today, even over something as small as a minor cut, I understood that I had already lost the fight to keep myself guarded. I care for you, Elara, more deeply than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone again." Elara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the raw honesty in his admission, and she reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking his hand in both of hers. "I am not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Whatever danger still surrounds us, whatever challenges Blackwood might still attempt, I chose to stand beside you, and that choice has only grown stronger with every week that has passed since I arrived here." "I believe you," Cale said, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried none of the careful guarding that had defined nearly every conversation between them since her arrival at the castle. "And I intend to prove myself worthy of that choice, for as long as you allow me the chance." They sat together for hours that night, sharing stories neither had spoken aloud before, memories of childhood and loss and hope that built a foundation of understanding far deeper than the careful performance that had originally brought them together. Alara told him about her mother, who had died when she was young, and about the years spent caring for her father as his health slowly declined under the weight of debts and hardship. Cale listened with the same intensity he brought to every council meeting, but softened now by genuine care rather than political necessity. It was well past midnight when Cale finally rose to leave, pausing once more at the door, his expression carrying a warmth that had become entirely natural between them now. Whatever fear I once carried, whatever walls I built to protect myself from loss, I do not regret letting them fall for you, he said quietly. I only regret that it took me so long to admit it. After he left, Alara sat alone by the fire for a long while, turning his words over in her mind, feeling the quiet certainty of something that had grown far beyond the arrangement that had originally brought them together. She had come to Thornwood Castle believing she could hold her heart apart from whatever happened here, complete her year, and leave unaffected. Sitting alone in the firelight, she finally allowed herself to fully accept what she had known, on some level, for weeks already. She had fallen in love with the Alpha King, not the crown he wore, or the arrangement that had brought them together, but the man beneath it, guarded and grieving, and slowly learning to trust again. And though she did not yet know what dangers still waited ahead, or whether Blackwood's ambitions had truly been defeated, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her chest, that she was no longer willing to imagine a future that did not include the man who had finally, fully let her in. In the days that followed, their bond seemed to deepen further, with an ease that surprised them both, as though acknowledging the truth openly had removed some final barrier that had been slowing its natural growth. Alara found herself waking some mornings with a quiet awareness of Cale's mood before she had even left her chambers, a faint sense of calm or tension that Petra assured her was simply the bond continuing to strengthen between them, a gift that would only grow more precise with time. They began spending entire afternoons together whenever their duties allowed, Cale showing her parts of the castle grounds she had not yet explored, an old library tower filled with maps charting the kingdom's history, a quiet grove where his mother had once kept a modest garden before her passing years earlier. Alara shared stories of her own in return, small memories of her childhood in the village, the songs her mother used to hum while working, the particular way her father laughed when something genuinely delighted him, memories that had grown painful to revisit alone, but felt lighter, somehow, shared with someone who listened as intently as Cale did. Dalen, the young guard who had befriended her during her earliest weeks at the castle, remarked on the change one afternoon as he escorted her back from the eastern gardens. You seem lighter these days, he observed, a friendly smile on his face. Happier than when you first arrived, if you do not mind me saying so. I did not expect to find happiness here, Alara admitted. I came prepared for a difficult year, a transaction to be endured, rather than a life to be lived. I am grateful to have been wrong about that. Lyra too noticed the shift, and one evening found Alara alone in the library, working through some of the political texts she had been assigned as part of her ongoing education in court matters. I wanted to tell you something, Lyra said, settling into the chair across from her. I have served this family for many years, watched Cale carry more grief and more weight than any young man should have to bear alone. I have not seen him, this at ease, since before his brother died. Whatever fear I once carried about your arrival here, I no longer carry it. You have been good for him, Alara, in ways I do not think either of you fully realizes yet. The words settled warmly into Alara's chest, another small confirmation of how far she had traveled from the frightened, uncertain woman who had first entered these castle walls months earlier. She thought of her father, safely settled now with resources enough to rebuild the life that had once seemed so precarious, and felt a quiet gratitude for the strange, unexpected path that had led her here, to a castle full of danger and politics that had somehow, despite every obstacle, also become a place where she had found something she had never expected to find. A love built slowly and honestly, from truth rather than pretense, strong enough now that she could not imagine willingly walking away from it when the year originally promised finally came to its end. The message arrived at dawn, carried by an exhausted courier whose horse had clearly been ridden hard through the night to reach Thornwood Castle before sunrise. Lyra brought it directly to Cale's private study, her expression grave enough that Ilara, summoned moments later, understood immediately that whatever news it carried was not going to be good. Blackwood has moved against the eastern settlements, Lyra said, spreading a hastily drawn map across the desk. 3 villages near the border, all within territory that owes allegiance to the crown. He claims the attacks are the work of unaligned raiders, but the pattern is too coordinated, too precisely timed with his recent defeat at the council session, to be anything other than a deliberate provocation. He wants to draw me out, Cale said, studying the map with narrowed eyes. A direct military response would give him grounds to claim I am overreaching my authority, particularly if I lead the response personally, rather than sending a general in my place. There is more, Lyra said, her voice tightening further. One of the messengers who escaped the 3rd village reported that Blackwood's men were specifically asking about the Queen, about Lady Ilara, about her movements, and whether she traveled with any regular escort. This is not merely a provocation, my king. I believe he intends to use her as leverage, to force your hand through means far more dangerous than a simple council challenge. The blood drained from Ilara's face as the implications settled over her, and she felt Cale's hand find hers instinctively, his grip tightening with a protectiveness that had become second nature between them over recent months. He would not dare move directly against her within these castle walls, Cale said, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that betrayed his own concern. Perhaps not directly, Lyra said, but you have both grown careless in recent weeks, walking the gardens without full escort, dining in quieter corners away from the main hall. If Blackwood has agents still watching the castle, even after Nora's departure, he may have identified opportunities we have not fully accounted for. The warning proved prophetic within days. A messenger arrived at the castle gates claiming urgent news from a nearby village that required the Queen's immediate attention regarding a matter of local charity work Ilara had quietly taken on since her arrival, distributing resources to families struggling the way her own family once had. It was the kind of errand Ilara had undertaken several times before without incident, and she agreed to travel with only a small escort, unaware that the message itself had been carefully fabricated to draw her outside the castle's protected walls. The ambush came less than an hour into the journey, along a forested stretch of road where the trees grew close enough to conceal a significant force without detection until it was too late. Ilara's small escort fought bravely, but they were badly outnumbered, and within minutes, she found herself pulled from her horse and bound, surrounded by men wearing no colors or crests to identify their allegiance, though she recognized the calculated precision of their movements as the same kind of training she had seen among Blackwood's own guards during his visit to the castle. Word reached Cale within the hour, carried by one of the surviving escort members who had managed to escape and ride back to the castle at full speed. Ilara had never seen him move with such raw, unrestrained urgency, abandoning every careful formality of kingship in favor of something far more primal, gathering his most trusted guards and riding out within minutes of receiving the news, his wolf clearly straining beneath the surface of his human form, in a way she had never witnessed before. She was held in a small hunting lodge deep within the forest, her captors clearly under orders to keep her unharmed but firmly contained, waiting for instructions that Ilara suspected would arrive from Blackwood himself. She used the hours of waiting to study her surroundings carefully, noting the guards' rotation patterns, the location of the single door, the small window too narrow to climb through but wide enough to potentially signal through if the opportunity arose. It was well past midnight when she felt it, a sudden, overwhelming surge of certainty that Cale was close, a pull in her chest that Petra had described weeks earlier as the growing strength of their bond. Moments later, the quiet forest erupted into chaos as Cale's forces struck the hunting lodge from multiple directions at once, guards shouting in confusion as they scrambled to respond to an attack they had clearly not expected to arrive so quickly or with such coordinated force. Ilara pressed herself into the corner of the small room, working desperately at the ropes binding her wrists, until the door burst open and Cale appeared, his eyes immediately finding hers across the chaos of the room, relief and fury warring visibly across his features. "I am here," he said, crossing the room in 3 quick strides, cutting through her bindings with a small blade, before pulling her into an embrace that carried the full weight of hours spent fearing the worst. "I felt something was wrong, the moment you left the castle. I should have trusted that instinct sooner." "You came in time," Ilara said, her voice shaking with the aftermath of fear and relief combined. That is what matters. The fighting outside the lodge continued for several more minutes before Kale's forces gained full control, capturing several of the remaining guards, while others fled into the darkness of the surrounding forest. Among those captured was a man who, under careful questioning, confirmed what everyone had already suspected, that the entire operation had been ordered directly by Duke Blackwood, with instructions to hold the Queen as leverage to force Kale into a position where the succession challenge could be reopened under more favorable terms. They rode back to Thornwood Castle before dawn, Elara wrapped in Kale's own cloak against the cold night air, her body still trembling slightly from the ordeal, despite the safety of his presence beside her. Neither spoke much during the ride, the events of the night settling heavily between them. But when they finally reached the castle, and the gates closed safely behind them, Kale pulled her into another embrace, this one lasting far longer than the urgency of their earlier reunion had allowed. "I could have lost you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a rawness that matched the fear she had seen in his eyes the moment he burst through the lodge door. "In all my years fearing loss, fearing what caring too deeply might cost me, I never imagined a fear as sharp as what I felt tonight, believing you were in danger and unable to reach you fast enough." "You reached me," Elara said, holding him just as tightly. "That is what I will remember about tonight. Not the fear, but the certainty that you would come." The captured guards provided enough evidence to bring formal charges against Blackwood before the full council, evidence that even his most loyal allies would struggle to dismiss, given the severity of directly threatening the crown's chosen mate through kidnapping and coordinated attacks against sworn territories. But even as preparations began for the formal proceedings that would likely end Blackwood's political ambitions permanently, Elara understood that the danger of the past days had changed something fundamental in how both she and Kale viewed the fragile arrangement that had originally brought them together. What had begun as a practical solution to a political problem had grown, through months of shared danger and slowly building trust, into something neither of them was willing to imagine losing. And as dawn broke fully over Thornwood Castle, casting warm light across walls that had witnessed both danger and growing devotion in equal measure, Elara understood that whatever formal proceedings still lay ahead to finally neutralize Blackwood's threat, the true resolution she cared about most had already been decided in the desperate relief of Kale's embrace within that small forest lodge, a certainty that whatever future waited beyond the immediate danger, they intended to face it together. In the days following the rescue, the castle settled into a careful, watchful calm. Guards doubled at every entrance, every messenger thoroughly questioned before being granted access to the grounds. Elara found herself unable to fully shake the lingering fear of those hours spent bound and waiting in the hunting lodge, small moments triggering memories she had not expected to carry so heavily, the sound of raised voices, the sight of unfamiliar riders approaching the castle gates, even the particular creak of a door opening unexpectedly behind her. Kale noticed her distress, though she tried to hide it, and rather than dismissing it or urging her to move past it quickly, he simply made himself present, sitting with her during the quiet moments when the fear resurfaced, offering steady, patient reassurance without ever making her feel diminished for needing it. "You do not need to pretend this did not frighten you," he told her one evening, as they sat together near the fire in his private study, her hand resting in his. "I was frightened too, more frightened than I have been since the day I learned of Ronan's death. There is no shame in carrying that fear honestly, rather than burying it beneath false composure." Petra, too, offered gentle guidance during this period, preparing calming teas from herbs she had long used to help soldiers and guards recover from the aftermath of violence, and spending patient hours simply sitting with Elara while she worked through the lingering weight of what had happened. "Fear does not disappear because danger has passed," Petra told her. "It simply needs time, and patience, and people who do not rush you toward forgetting before you are ready." Dalen and several of the other guards who had grown fond of Elara during her months at the castle took her safety personally, several volunteering for additional watches around her chambers without being asked, a quiet show of loyalty that moved her more than she expected. Even Lyra, whose relationship with Elara had transformed so completely since those early weeks of suspicion, insisted on accompanying her personally whenever she left the castle grounds for any reason, unwilling to risk a second attempt succeeding where the first had failed. Slowly, over the following weeks, the sharp edges of the fear began to soften, replaced gradually by a steadier resolve. a determination that whatever Blackwood had hoped to achieve through the kidnapping, he had instead only strengthened the bond between Elara and Cale, proving beyond any doubt the depth of what had grown between them and the lengths each was willing to go to protect the other. By the time the council formally convened to address Blackwood's actions, Elara found herself standing tall beside Cale, no longer the frightened woman who had first arrived at Thornwood Castle believing herself entirely alone in a dangerous, unfamiliar world, but a woman who had found, through hardship and danger in equal measure, a place and a purpose and a love she was fully prepared to fight to protect. The formal council session convened 2 weeks later, and this time it was Duke Blackwood who stood accused, facing the assembled pack leaders with none of the calm confidence he had carried during his earlier challenge. The evidence gathered from the captured guards, combined with testimony from the survivors of the Eastern Village attacks, painted a picture too damning for even his most loyal allies to defend, and the council stripped him of his territorial authority within hours, exiling him from the kingdom's protected lands, under terms that ensured he would never again pose a direct threat to the throne. Elara watched the proceedings from beside Cale, feeling the weight of months of danger finally lifting from her shoulders. As the council formally closed the matter, the succession question resolved beyond any future challenge. Blackwood was led from the hall under guard, his ambitions finally and completely dismantled, and though a small part of her recognized that other dangers would likely arise in the years ahead, as they always did for anyone who ruled a kingdom, the immediate threat that had shadowed her entire time at Thornwood Castle was, at last, fully behind them. They returned to the castle in the days that followed, to a court that had shifted entirely in its regard for her, nobles, who had once watched with suspicion, now offering genuine respect, servants, who had once whispered speculation, now greeting her with warm familiarity. The transformation still felt strange to Elara, remembering how frightened and out of place she had felt during her first weeks within these walls, but she found herself settling into the role with a confidence she had not believed herself capable of when this arrangement first began. It was Petra who noticed the change in Cale first, catching Elara alone in the healer's quarters one afternoon, with an expression of quiet, knowing satisfaction. "He has been different since the rescue," Petra observed, continuing her work sorting herbs with practiced hands. "Lighter, somehow, despite everything that happened. I believe facing the possibility of losing you helped him finally release some of the guilt he has carried since his brother's death. He understands now, in a way he perhaps did not fully understand before, that loving deeply does not guarantee loss. Sometimes it simply means having something worth protecting fiercely enough to fight for." Elara found the truth of those words confirmed that very evening, when Cale requested she join him in the castle gardens after dinner, his manner carrying a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him, even during the most tense political negotiations of recent months. The gardens had been transformed since her arrival months earlier, spring blooms filling the pathways with color and fragrance that made the entire space feel almost unrecognizable, from the gray, formal grounds she remembered from her first weeks at the castle. "I have something I wish to say to you," Cale said, once they reached the small stone bench near the garden's center fountain, the same spot where they had once discussed the careful rules meant to keep their arrangement contained and uncomplicated. "Do you remember the promise we made here, months ago, about keeping distance between us, about ending this arrangement cleanly when the year concluded?" "I remember," Elara said, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the sudden nervousness in her chest at the direction of the conversation. "I have broken nearly every part of that promise," Cale said, his voice carrying a warmth that had become entirely natural between them over recent months. "I told myself I could keep my heart guarded, that I could complete this arrangement without allowing myself to feel anything beyond what was necessary to maintain appearances. I was wrong about that from nearly the very beginning, though it took me far too long to admit it, even to myself." He knelt then, before her, on the stone path beneath the blooming flowers, and Elara felt her breath catch as she understood what was happening. Months of careful pretense finally giving way to something entirely genuine. "I do not want to pretend marriage any longer," Cale said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability written clearly across his face. "I do not want a year that ends with you leaving these walls to build a life somewhere else, while I remain here, carrying the weight of having let you go, simply because our original agreement demanded it. My wolf chose you the moment I found you standing in that village yard, defending your father with more courage than most trained warriors I have commanded. My heart followed that choice more slowly. Guarded by fear I am only now learning to release fully. Elara Voss, will you marry me? Not as part of a political arrangement, not to silence any challenge or satisfy any council requirement, but because I love you, fully and completely, and cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone else standing beside me. Tears gathered in Elara's eyes as she looked down at him, months of careful guardedness of her own, finally dissolving completely in the face of his genuine, unguarded declaration. She thought of her father, safe and provided for in the village she had once feared she would never see safely again. She thought of the fear and uncertainty of her first days within these castle walls, the careful rules and cautious distance that had gradually given way to something far deeper than either of them had anticipated when this arrangement first began. She thought of the danger they had faced together, the trust they had slowly built, the love that had grown despite every reason either of them had to keep their hearts carefully protected. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion, as she pulled him up from the ground, and into an embrace that carried the full weight of everything they had built together over the past year. "Yes, I will marry you, not as part of any arrangement, but because I love you too, completely, and without reservation." The wedding that followed weeks later bore little resemblance to the hastily arranged engagement ceremony that had once introduced Elara to the court as a political necessity. This time, the entire kingdom celebrated genuinely, nobles and villagers alike gathering to witness vows, exchanged not out of political calculation, but out of hard-won, deeply tested love. Elara's father traveled from their village to stand at her side, his health fully recovered under the resources the arrangement had originally provided. His pride and joy evident as he watched his daughter exchange vows with the king who had once arrived at their door to save them both from ruin. Lyra, who had once regarded Elara with open suspicion, stood among the closest witnesses to the ceremony, her sharp features softened by genuine warmth as she watched the culmination of months spent carefully guiding Elara through the complicated world of court politics. Petra offered a quiet blessing rooted in the old traditions of mate bonds, acknowledging before the gathered crowd what she had recognized months earlier, long before either Kale or Elara had been ready to fully claim it themselves. As the ceremony concluded, and Kale pulled Elara into a kiss that sealed vows both public and deeply personal, she felt the full weight of everything that had brought them to this moment, the desperate arrangement born of hardship and necessity, the careful walls both of them had built and slowly dismantled, the danger they had faced and overcome together, and the genuine, hard-won love that had grown from pretense into something entirely real. She had arrived at Thornwood Castle believing she was only meant to pretend, to play a role for a single year, before returning to a simpler life, far from crowns and courts and political danger. Standing now beside the king who had become, genuinely and completely, the center of her world, she understood that some arrangements, however they begin, carry the potential to become something far greater than either party could have originally imagined, if both are willing to let their carefully guarded hearts finally, fully open. The kingdom of Thornwood entered a new era that day, not merely because a political threat had been neutralized or a succession question resolved, but because its king and queen had found, in each other, something worth protecting more fiercely than any throne, a love built not on pretense but on truth, tested by danger and strengthened by trust, ready now to guide their kingdom forward together, for as long as they both remained willing to choose each other, one day at a time. The celebration that followed the ceremony stretched long into the evening, the castle grounds filled with music and laughter, tables laden with food enough to feed every villager who had traveled to witness the occasion. Elara moved through the crowd with a warmth and confidence entirely different from the frightened uncertainty of her first weeks at court, greeting nobles and villagers alike with the easy grace of someone who had finally found her true place, in a world that had once felt impossibly foreign to her. Dalen approached her during a quiet moment, offering a warm bow, before breaking into the easy smile she had grown fond of during her months at the castle. "I told you they would soften," he said, gesturing toward the celebrating crowd. "Though I confess, I did not expect the transformation to run quite this deep." "Neither did I," Elara admitted, laughing. "Thank you, Dalen, for the kindness you showed me, before anyone else here was willing to." Lyra found her shortly after, embracing her with a warmth that would have seemed impossible during those early, suspicious weeks. "I am glad to have been wrong about you," she said simply, The kingdom is fortunate to have found a queen willing to fight for it as fiercely as you have." Petra offered her own quiet blessing later that evening, drawing Elara aside to share a small vial of oil infused with herbs, meant, according to old tradition, to bless a new bond with health and longevity. "Your path here was not an easy one," Petra said, pressing the vial gently into her hands. "But few things worth having ever arrive easily. You have earned this happiness, Elara, every part of it." As the evening wore on, Cale found her near the same fountain where he had knelt to propose weeks earlier, drawing her away from the celebration for a few quiet moments alone, beneath the star-filled sky. "Do you remember what you told me, that first night in my study, before we ever left your village?" he asked. "You asked why I chose you, and I told you it was because you wanted nothing from the crown." "I remember," Elara said, smiling at the memory of how uncertain and frightened she had felt that night, how impossibly far away this moment would have seemed to her then. "I was wrong about so much that night," Cale admitted. "I thought I was choosing someone who would remain unaffected by all of this, someone who could walk away cleanly when the year ended, without either of us feeling any true loss. I did not understand then that I was choosing far more than a political solution. I was choosing the person who would teach me how to want something again, how to hope again, without the fear of loss controlling every choice I made." "And I did not understand," Elara said, "that agreeing to protect my father would lead me to a love I never believed myself capable of finding, especially not within walls, as guarded and dangerous as these once seemed to me." They stood together beneath the stars for a long while, the sounds of celebration continuing faintly behind them. Two people who had begun as strangers bound only by necessity, now standing as partners bound by choice, by trust hard-won through danger and honesty in equal measure, ready to face whatever the future of their kingdom might bring, together, as they had promised each other beneath these very same stars only weeks before, and as they intended to keep promising each other for every year that still lay ahead.